Fake HOA police tried to arrest me, but they don't know that I'm a SWAT commander. I never thought living in a quiet suburban neighborhood could feel like walking through a battlefield. My name is Alex Mercer, and I'm not just another homeowner trying to enjoy my peaceful life. I'm a SWAT commander with years of experience in high-stakes operations. Most people in my community only know me as the guy with the meticulously trimmed lawn and the well-kept garage, the neighbor who waves politely and keeps to himself. Nobody suspects the other side of me, the part trained to handle extreme danger, to assess threats in milliseconds, and to act decisively when every second counts. Life in my neighborhood had always seemed ordinary. Rows of similar houses, pristine streets, and the ever-watchful HOA keeping everyone in line. I thought the HOA was mostly harmless, just a few people fussing over lawn lengths, mailbox colors, and the occasional overgrown shrub. But beneath the surface of this idyllic suburban calm, tension was simmering, waiting for the right moment to erupt. And I had no idea that moment was about to arrive. It started with the notices. At first, they were innocuous enough. Warnings about a slightly tilted fence post or a bush that encroached a foot into the neighbor's yard. Typical HOA nonsense. But then the tone shifted. The letters became aggressive, threatening fines, penalties, and even legal action for minor infractions that barely existed. I brushed it off at first, thinking they were just overzealous rule followers. But the escalation was alarming. I could feel the undercurrent of power, the HOA pushing, prying, asserting dominance over people who simply wanted to live peacefully. I made it clear in my own subtle ways that I wasn't intimidated. I filed counters, kept records, and followed every rule to the letter, but they didn't stop. It was as if someone within the HOA had decided to make me a target. And then came the day I realized this wasn't about lawn care or mailbox colors anymore. I was at home one quiet Saturday morning, enjoying my usual cup of coffee and scanning through the news, when I noticed an unusual movement outside. A cluster of cars had pulled up near my driveway, unmarked, black SUVs with dark-tinted windows. My heart rate didn't spike the way it would have for an ordinary homeowner. I recognized the posture, the tension in their stance, and the deliberate, coordinated movements. Trained instincts kicked in instantly. Something was wrong. Before I could fully assess, they approached, men and women in what looked like uniforms, badges gleaming in the sunlight, and authoritative stances that demanded compliance. They introduced themselves as HOA enforcement officers, a term that immediately set off every alarm in my mind. Their tone was sharp, commanding, and suspiciously law enforcement-like, despite the fact that HOA officers don't have the power to arrest anyone. They claimed I was in violation of multiple community rules and demanded that I come with them. For a moment, I played along, maintaining a calm exterior. I observed their body language, the subtle hand movements near pockets, the way they spread themselves to block exits, the staccato rhythm of their instructions. Everything screamed fake authority trying to enforce fear. My mind cataloged every detail, every weakness, every potential leverage point. They insisted they had the legal authority to detain me, citing obscure HOA bylaws as justification. I could see the adrenaline-fueled confidence in their eyes, the assumption that a regular suburban homeowner would simply comply out of fear. But they didn't know me, and they certainly didn't know my background. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. These self-appointed enforcers had no idea that the man they were attempting to intimidate could outmaneuver them in every conceivable way. As the standoff continued, I began to assess my surroundings. The front yard, the garage, the side paths, all potential escape routes or defensive positions. I considered every angle, every scenario, while keeping my calm facade. I noticed the smallest details. The scuff marks on their shoes indicating how recently they had been in action, the tension in their shoulders suggesting nervousness, the micro-expressions betraying fear beneath their forced authority. They had come prepared to intimidate me, but I was the one fully prepared to respond. Minutes stretched, though it felt like hours. I continued to keep my tone neutral, my posture relaxed, but every muscle was coiled like a spring. My mind calculated the probabilities. The odds of them trying a sudden aggressive move, the fastest ways to disarm or escape, and the psychological leverage I could exert over them. I understood fear and authority in ways they could not possibly comprehend. They were amateurs playing a game they didn't even know had rules beyond intimidation. And then it happened, the moment that would turn everything upside down. One of them took a step closer, reaching for what looked like a detention device. That was, in reality, just a prop to scare homeowners. That step was a mistake. In that instant, my instincts flared. I didn't move yet, didn't speak, but the air shifted. They could feel the change, even if they couldn't see it. The predator-prey dynamic had flipped, though they hadn't realized it. Before I could act, a familiar inner voice kicked in, a voice honed over years of high-stakes operations, a voice that told me exactly how to control the situation without anyone getting hurt. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was a trained SWAT commander assessing a potentially dangerous engagement in real time. Every movement, every calculated pause, every subtle shift in position was designed to assert control without revealing the full extent of my capabilities. As I prepared to make my move, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. One of them, younger, inexperienced, glancing nervously at the others, hesitation written across their face. They were not fully committed, and that split-second doubt was all I needed. I was ready to turn the tables, to expose their bluff, to reclaim my home and my authority in a way they would never forget. And just as I was about to act, a sudden sound pierced the tense silence. A vehicle engine revving down the street, drawing attention, creating a potential distraction. Everything hung in a delicate balance, the air thick with anticipation. I knew the next few seconds would determine the course of this standoff, and I had to be precise. Every choice mattered. I braced myself, heart steady, senses sharp, knowing that the ordinary facade of suburban life had been shattered. What had started as a routine HOA conflict was now teetering on the edge of chaos. And the next move I made would either expose them completely, or escalate the situation in ways none of us could predict. The scene froze, like a cinematic moment suspended in time. I felt the weight of history in the making, the shift from victim to commander, from intimidated homeowner to the one holding all the cards. And then, with the world outside my front door holding its breath, I made my decision. The tension is at its peak as I prepare to confront the fake HOA police, and the very next moment could either end the standoff or ignite a full-blown confrontation. The seconds after that engine roar felt stretched into eternity. Every fiber of my body was alert, every sense on overdrive. My heart was calm, controlled, because I had to be. Panic would have been lethal. I knew the fake HOA enforcers were counting on fear, on hesitation, on my uncertainty. But they had underestimated me, and that was their fatal mistake. I slowly shifted my weight, subtly positioning myself to keep both the front door and garage entrances in my line of sight. My eyes never left them, analyzing, memorizing every detail, the slight twitch of a hand, the subtle fidgeting, the way they adjusted their posture as if to hide nerves. They thought they could intimidate me, but now they were the ones under pressure. The youngest of the group took a tentative step forward, as if testing the waters. I could see it in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, a question lingering in their mind. Does he know? They didn't know the half of it. I had spent years in situations far more dangerous than this, where hesitation could cost lives, where instincts were honed to a razor edge. Every muscle, every nerve, every synapse in my brain was primed for a precise response. I kept my tone calm and deliberate, narrating my own thoughts in my mind as a mental preparation. The facade of civility remained outwardly, but inside, I was already planning the moves that would dismantle them without violence if possible. I noticed their formation. They had blocked the driveway, encircled the lawn, and left themselves no room for retreat. That was their first tactical error. Crowding in, overconfident, underestimating me. Rookie mistake. As the youngest fidgeted, one of the older officers raised what looked like a clipboard, pointing to my home as though it were a crime scene. I recognized the tactic immediately, intimidation through semblance of authority. They wanted me to comply, to admit some fabricated wrongdoing, to feel powerless. They were playing a psychological game, and I had all the cards. I took a measured step forward, ensuring my movements were deliberate and visible. Calm, collected, unafraid. The shift in energy was palpable. Their eyes darted, searching for signs of weakness, but they found none. My posture was relaxed yet commanding. I was no longer the target, they were. The predator-prey dynamic had reversed, though they hadn't realized it yet. I assessed the environment meticulously. My garage door, just a few feet away, could serve as cover if needed. The landscaping provided subtle angles and concealment. Every object in my yard, every structure, could be used to gain tactical advantage. My mind mapped the possibilities, calculating the risks and outcomes with split-second precision. These were amateurs, and I was a professional. Then, almost in unison, they started advancing, slow, deliberate steps, trying to herd me toward compliance. That's when I allowed the first ripple of intensity to show. A subtle narrowing of my eyes, a tightening of my jaw, an almost imperceptible shift in stance. They hesitated. They could feel it, even if they didn't understand why. I was in control now. My thoughts raced, strategizing the next move. The goal was not confrontation, not violence, it was exposure. I wanted to dismantle their facade, reveal the bluff, make them understand they had misjudged who I was. The moment needed precision. Too soon, and it could explode. Too late, and the psychological advantage could be lost. I made a slow, deliberate step toward them, keeping my gaze steady. The tension thickened. They flinched slightly at the movement, subconsciously reacting to my confidence. Their authority was brittle, built on intimidation and fear, and now it was cracking. I could sense the first waves of panic rippling through the group. Then it happened. One of them, the oldest, attempted to assert dominance by stepping closer and raising a hand, signaling for compliance. That hand, that gesture. It was the opening I had been waiting for. In one fluid, practiced motion, I positioned myself to assert authority. Not aggression, not violence, control. Every tiny shift I made radiated confidence, dominance, and unshakable composure. I could see the doubt deepen in their eyes. The youngest froze entirely, caught between fear and confusion. The middle-aged enforcer glanced at his peers, uncertainty written all over his face. Their plan had been simple: scare a homeowner, get compliance, show they could control the neighborhood. But the plan was crumbling. They had no idea they were facing a trained SWAT commander, someone who understood tactics, psychology, and human behavior at a professional level. At that moment, the engine outside revved again, closer this time. I realized it was more than a distraction. It was timing, a potential catalyst for chaos. I calculated the optimal approach: maintain calm, project authority, and subtly control the environment while letting their overconfidence collapse under pressure. I began to advance, slowly but unmistakably, each step radiating certainty. The youngest wavered, the older one flinched slightly, and the middle-aged enforcer's hands trembled just enough to betray his fear. They were amateurs, relying on fake badges and faux authority. I was the reality they couldn't control. And then the realization hit them. I wasn't just any homeowner, they had picked the wrong target. Their bluffs were transparent, their intimidation tactics hollow, their control imaginary. I could see the shift, the micro-expressions, the subtle changes in breathing, the sudden tension in their shoulders. Their confidence was evaporating, replaced by raw uncertainty. I maintained a calm exterior, but inside, every training drill, every mission, every high-stress scenario I had ever faced coalesced into perfect clarity. I didn't need to act violently to win, I just needed to show them that I had all the power in this encounter. Every gesture, every shift of weight, every measured breath was part of a mental chess game they had no chance of winning. And then the youngest made a fateful decision. A slight step backward, almost imperceptible, but enough to expose their lack of preparation. I recognized it immediately. Fear had taken hold, and fear was contagious. The older ones froze, glancing at each other for guidance. Guidance was non-existent. They were alone, facing someone they had no idea how to confront. The standoff hung in the air like a storm about to break. I was ready, poised to act decisively, knowing that the next moment would define everything. Every second was a test of nerves, of control, of dominance. One wrong move, and the situation could spiral, but I had the advantage. I was no longer merely defending my home. I was orchestrating the collapse of their deception, and it was about to be spectacular. And just as the tension reached its peak, I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a potential ally or an unexpected complication. The world seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed. The confrontation was about to reach its tipping point, and I knew that in the next few moments, everything would change. The fake HOA enforcers are beginning to realize they've underestimated me, and the standoff is about to escalate. A sudden movement at the edge of my vision promises either help or a new threat. Time seemed to stretch, almost unbearably slow, as I watched the sudden movement at the edge of my vision. It wasn't a new adversary, nor an unexpected ally. It was the tiniest distraction, but enough to tip the scales. I recognized the psychological leverage immediately. In high-pressure situations, even minor distractions can unbalance the unprepared. And these fake HOA enforcers were dangerously unprepared. I advanced with deliberate caution, each step a statement. My presence filled the space, a silent assertion of authority that needed no words. They shuffled backward slightly, a few inches at a time, betraying their internal panic. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Every trained instinct told me that power in these situations came from composure, not force. My calmness was a weapon far sharper than anything they carried, or pretended to carry. The clipboard, the fake badges, the attempts to intimidate, they were all unraveling. I noticed the subtle cracks in their formation, a hand hovering near a pocket, eyes darting nervously, uneven breathing patterns. The youngest was barely holding it together, almost frozen with indecision. The older one tried to signal some form of coordination, but their hierarchy and authority were collapsing right in front of my eyes. I could feel their uncertainty radiating outward. It was like a fog slowly enveloping them, obscuring their confidence, choking their bravado. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I didn't need to act with aggression. I just needed to assert the truth of my identity, to make them understand that their bluff had no standing here. Subtly, I allowed a slight shift in my stance, a minor movement that hinted at readiness without revealing my full capabilities. It was enough to send the message. I was not a typical homeowner, and they were about to face consequences far beyond their imagination. Their gaze flicked toward my hands, then my posture, then my eyes, searching desperately for a sign of weakness they would never find. As I stepped closer, I noticed that one of them began to sweat. Not just the casual discomfort of being in the sun, but real, palpable fear. The kind that comes when someone realizes they have misjudged the situation completely. I allowed a tiny smirk to cross my face, not malicious, but a subtle acknowledgement of their mistake. They were amateurs, trying to play a professional game. And I was about to show them just how professional the stakes could get. I scanned the area again, noting every potential avenue of escape or confrontation. My garage offered cover, the side path could serve as a tactical maneuvering point, and the driveway allowed me to control their movements. Everything was mapped in my mind with military precision. I didn't need to escalate to violence, but I could if necessary. That silent threat was more powerful than any words I could speak. Then came the tipping point. One of the older enforcers stepped forward, attempting to regain control, raise his voice, and reassert the authority that had already crumbled. I didn't respond aggressively, didn't mirror his desperation. Instead, I let the air of inevitability work in my favor. I allowed the faintest demonstration of confidence, a subtle hand gesture, a controlled stance, that communicated dominance without aggression. Their eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. Panic rippled through them as the realization sunk in. They were facing someone whose experience, training, and mental fortitude far exceeded their own. The youngest stammered internally, the middle-aged one froze completely, and the oldest tried desperately to recapture some sense of control. It was futile. I began to subtly advance, one measured step at a time. Each movement was designed to dismantle their bluff further, to break down the structure of fear they had tried to impose. The air between us became thick, charged with tension. Their confidence dissolved into uncertainty, and uncertainty in high-stakes scenarios always leads to mistakes. Then, the first mistake appeared. The youngest enforcer fumbled with what they had been holding, a clipboard, a pen, some contrived paperwork meant to reinforce their authority. Their hands trembled, and their eyes flicked to the others as if silently begging for guidance that didn't exist. The hierarchy they had relied upon was gone. I had dismantled it, one subtle cue at a time. I allowed myself a controlled, almost imperceptible movement forward, enough to trigger a psychological reaction. They flinched. Their stance wavered. Every ounce of bravado and intimidation they had attempted to wield was evaporating. They had walked into my world, and now the rules had changed. I considered my next move carefully. I could have escalated immediately, used my training to immobilize them, but that wasn't necessary yet. Psychological dominance was more effective, and more satisfying. I wanted them to understand the full scope of their error, to feel the humiliation and confusion of underestimating someone who had spent a career handling threats far more serious than this. The tension was almost unbearable. Time seemed to slow as I read each micro-expression, each involuntary twitch, each subconscious reaction. They were unraveling, and I could orchestrate the outcome with surgical precision. It was exhilarating, not in a reckless way, but in the deep, controlled satisfaction of a professional observing amateurs collapse under their own hubris. And then I decided to reveal the truth. Not with words, not immediately, but through subtle cues, my posture, the way I moved, the controlled intensity in my gaze. Slowly, the implications sank in. These were not ordinary homeowners, nor were they defenseless. This was someone who had been trained to deal with danger, someone who could predict their every move before they even thought it. I could see the change immediately. The oldest enforcer's face paled, and the youngest hands trembled noticeably. They were no longer attempting to assert authority. Now, they were attempting to survive a confrontation they never expected. Their police-like stance had collapsed entirely under the weight of reality. I took another step forward, deliberate, calculated, radiating control. They flinched in unison, a synchronous display of panic, as if the universe had finally revealed the truth. They were outmatched, outclassed, and completely exposed. I could feel their fear, their desperation, their realization that they had misjudged me completely. Then, just as the tension reached its absolute peak, I prepared for the next phase. My mind ran through all contingencies, all potential outcomes, all ways to ensure that the threat was neutralized without violence. I didn't need to act with aggression, the psychological impact alone was enough. But I was ready if necessary. And in that suspended moment, I knew the final confrontation was approaching. I had turned the tables completely, exposed their bluff, and brought them to the edge of realization. The outcome depended on their next move, and I had already written the script in my mind. The fake HOA enforcers are fully exposed, panic-stricken, and outmatched, but one final misstep from them could trigger a confrontation that escalates beyond anyone's expectations. The air was electric, almost suffocating in its intensity. I could feel the shift in control. Every microsecond, every movement, every breath told the story. The fake HOA enforcers were no longer orchestrating fear, they were reacting to it. I was the conductor now, and the symphony of tension played entirely on my terms. Their authority had collapsed completely, leaving only a fragile veneer of confidence that would crumble at the slightest pressure. I advanced another step, slow and deliberate, letting my presence dominate the space. Their eyes widened further, the youngest nearly frozen, the middle-aged one glancing frantically at the others as if seeking guidance that simply didn't exist. The oldest attempted a firm stance, the final threat of their bluff, but it wavered instantly under my unwavering gaze. Every trained instinct in my body was alert. I didn't need to touch them to assert control. The subtle cues were enough, my posture, the measured pace of my movements, the calm intensity radiating from every part of me. They were amateurs, and they could feel it. The gap between their preparation and my experience was a chasm, impossible to bridge in the heat of this standoff. I surveyed my surroundings with a practiced eye. The driveway provided a natural corridor, the landscaping gave me both cover and tactical angles, and my front door offered a controlled point of retreat if needed. Everything was accounted for. I could see the panic rising in them with surgical clarity, and I let it simmer, allowing it to eat away at their confidence bit by bit. Then came the first audible sign of real fear. The youngest fumbled again, knocking a small item from their belt to the ground. The sound echoed across the driveway, unnerving the rest. They glanced down in unison, their eyes betraying desperation and embarrassment. I didn't need to move a muscle. The psychological advantage was already mine. I decided it was time to escalate the pressure, but carefully, methodically, without risking unnecessary confrontation. I stepped slightly to the side, subtly shifting the angle of control, forcing them to reposition. The youngest stumbled slightly, the oldest cursed under their breath, and the middle-aged one's hands twitched. Panic had taken full control. It was then I realized the most critical part of the standoff: perception. They were still operating under the assumption that they could intimidate me because of perceived authority. But perception, in my experience, was fragile and manipulable. I needed to make them see the truth, to expose the bluff completely without letting them salvage even a shred of their composure. I allowed a faint smirk to appear on my face, not malicious, but confident. Their reaction was immediate. A visible flinch from the youngest, a subtle narrowing of the oldest's eyes, a desperate shift in stance from the middle-aged enforcer. They were unraveling exactly as I had anticipated. Their movements were no longer coordinated, their confidence evaporating with every heartbeat. Then I made a calculated move. I subtly shifted my weight, angled my shoulders, and projected my voice, not to shout, but to speak with calm authority. Even without words, my demeanor communicated one clear message: I was in control, and they were exposed. They could feel it in their bones, an invisible force pressing against their bluff, shattering it piece by piece. At that moment, the youngest panicked completely, taking an involuntary step backward. It was a mistake, a tiny misstep with enormous consequences. The others tried to correct, to regroup, but it was too late. The rhythm of their intimidation had been broken. The confidence they had relied on was gone, replaced with raw, unfiltered fear. I continued to advance, each movement measured, deliberate, asserting dominance without aggression. The effect was immediate. The oldest's jaw tightened, their stance wavered, and the middle-aged enforcer's eyes darted nervously. They were realizing, perhaps too late, that they had chosen the wrong target, the wrong house, and the wrong opponent. I could see the calculation in their eyes, trying to figure out a new plan, a way to salvage this disaster. But I had anticipated it all. Every possible contingency had been accounted for. Their only options were retreat, exposure, or escalating into chaos, and none of them were equipped to handle the latter. Then, a sudden sound from the street caught their attention, a neighbor's car door slamming, distant voices calling out. It was insignificant in itself, but in the context of their fragile psychological state, it was catastrophic. The youngest froze entirely, the middle-aged one hesitated, and the oldest's last shred of composure cracked visibly. Their timing, their coordination, their bluff, it was gone. I had reached the critical juncture. They were exposed, their authority shattered, and their bluff laid bare for all to see. I could end this here, without a single aggressive move, and yet the temptation to push just a little further was irresistible. I wanted them to truly understand the consequences of underestimating someone like me, someone trained, disciplined, and prepared for every eventuality. I allowed a subtle step forward, closer now, my presence unmistakable, overwhelming. They flinched in unison, and the youngest's breath hitched audibly. The illusion of control they had tried to wield for hours was gone. They were caught entirely in the web they had spun for me, and they didn't even realize how deep they had fallen. Then, the moment of truth arrived. I could see the oldest glance at the others, a silent plea for an exit, a way to escape the unfolding humiliation. But I didn't offer it. The standoff had reached its zenith, the tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. They were trapped in their own deception, powerless against the presence of someone who had not only anticipated every move but had also turned the entire situation into a lesson in psychological dominance. And in that suspended moment, I knew the next move would define the outcome completely. I had forced them to confront the reality they had ignored, the reality that I was not just a homeowner, but a SWAT commander, trained to assess, control, and dominate situations far more dangerous than a petty HOA confrontation. The world outside my front yard seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable resolution. I was poised, controlled, and completely in command. And I could see it, the flicker of understanding in their eyes, the dawning realization that they had walked into a trap of their own making. But then, just as the tension reached its absolute peak, an unexpected factor appeared, something neither I nor they had anticipated. A new variable, a wild card that threatened to shift the balance once again. My instincts flared. I sensed danger, opportunity, and a turning point that could either end the standoff decisively or push it to the brink of chaos. The fake HOA enforcers are fully exposed and panic-stricken, but a sudden, unexpected variable appears that could either finalize their defeat or escalate the confrontation beyond control. The sudden movement at the edge of my vision had been small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to reset the tension in the driveway. My instincts flared instantly. Years of SWAT training had taught me that even minor variables could be catastrophic if ignored. I didn't know yet whether this was a neighbor inadvertently approaching, an escalation by the fake HOA enforcers, or some unforeseen complication, but I had to treat it as a potential threat. I held my position, every muscle coiled, senses on high alert. The air was thick with fear from the group of imposters in front of me, yet that same fear was my ally now. Their confidence was gone, their formation broken, and their intimidation tactics had evaporated under the weight of reality. I had them exactly where I wanted them, exposed, vulnerable, and terrified. They tried to adjust, to regain control, but it was futile. The youngest moved hesitantly, glancing toward the new variable, while the middle-aged one shifted his weight awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to do. The oldest enforcer tried to mask his panic with a forced authoritative stance, but it was meaningless. They had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and their bluff completely dismantled. I took a deliberate step forward, calm and measured, asserting dominance without raising my voice. Their reactions were instantaneous. Flinches, widened eyes, rapid breathing, hands hovering near pockets they had no idea how to use effectively. I had transformed this standoff from one of intimidation into one of complete control. They were no longer the ones wielding authority. I was. Then I made the decisive move. I allowed my posture, movements, and presence to signal what they had been too blind to recognize. I was not an ordinary homeowner. I was a SWAT commander. Every instinct, every detail of my training, every tactical decision I had ever learned coalesced into this moment. They felt it in the pit of their stomachs, even before I revealed it explicitly. I advanced closer, forcing them to react. The youngest stumbled backward, the oldest tensed visibly, and the middle-aged enforcer's breathing grew uneven. I had created a psychological stranglehold, controlling not just their bodies but their minds. Fear radiated off them in waves, and I knew that the next seconds would define the outcome. The variable on the street suddenly became clear. It was a curious neighbor, drawn out by the commotion, stopping at the edge of the lawn. I had to act fast, maintaining full control over both the imposters and any potential witnesses. Every action was deliberate. I moved to position myself between the neighbor and the fake HOA enforcers, ensuring no one could misinterpret the situation or escalate it further. With that obstacle accounted for, I turned my attention back to the imposters. Their bluff had been completely exposed, their tactics meaningless, and their confidence shattered. I allowed a subtle shift in posture, a slight narrowing of the eyes, signaling that I could take action at any moment, but that I was offering them a chance to resolve this without chaos. The tension was suffocating. I could see the realization dawning in their eyes. They had overstepped, miscalculated, and walked into a situation they could never have anticipated. Their fake authority was meaningless here, and they were utterly exposed. I could feel the control radiating from me, dominating every aspect of the standoff. I moved forward another step, close enough to assert presence, but careful to avoid unnecessary confrontation. The youngest whimpered internally, their composure completely gone. The middle-aged one shifted uneasily, trying to regain some semblance of coordination, but it was futile. The oldest, the ringleader perhaps, swallowed hard, realizing that this entire operation had been a complete failure. I allowed myself a small, controlled display of force, enough to make them understand that I could act decisively if they tried to push further. It wasn't aggression, it was dominance. The effect was immediate. Their body language collapsed, hands dropped slightly, shoulders slumped, eyes averted. The psychological hold I had built was absolute. Then, I revealed the final truth. Not in words yet, but through presence, posture, and subtle cues. They were facing a trained SWAT commander, someone capable of neutralizing threats without hesitation, someone whose experience in real danger far exceeded their manufactured authority. Panic turned to disbelief, disbelief turned to fear, and fear turned to full submission. The youngest flinched again, eyes darting frantically, realizing they were trapped. The middle-aged enforcer looked like he was about to collapse under pressure. The oldest tried a final gesture of authority, a feeble, meaningless attempt, but I ignored it entirely. It was over. They had lost the psychological battle completely. I took one more deliberate step, closing the distance enough to assert total dominance. Their remaining semblance of composure crumbled. I had won without a single aggressive action. Their bluff had been exposed, their intimidation failed, and the reality of who I was had shifted the balance entirely. Then came the resolution. I allowed them a clear path to retreat, offering them the only option left: leave. Their egos, bruised and shattered, had no choice but to retreat. I had given them a chance to survive the encounter without escalation, but make no mistake, they would never forget it. As they backed away, defeated, I surveyed the scene. My yard, my home, my domain had been threatened, but now it was secure. Every step of the confrontation had been controlled, calculated, and executed with precision. They had walked into a storm they could not survive, and I had guided them through it without a single misstep. The neighbor, still standing at the edge of the street, glanced at me in awe and confusion, sensing that something extraordinary had occurred. I nodded subtly, letting them understand without explanation. Some battles didn't require words, they required presence, authority, and mastery of fear. The impostors disappeared down the street, their confidence shattered, their authority exposed as a lie. I watched until they were gone, every sense alert for any lingering threat. But the driveway was empty now, the tension dissipating, and my home secure once again. And in that quiet aftermath, I reflected on the ordeal. This had been more than a confrontation with fake HOA enforcers. It had been a test of control, of psychological dominance, and of the careful application of training under pressure. I had turned the tables completely, exposed the bluff, and asserted authority without a single act of physical aggression. Yet, even as the adrenaline subsided, I knew this was only part of the story. The HOA, the community, and anyone who had underestimated me now understood a harsh truth: they had crossed a line, and they would never make the same mistake again. The fake HOA enforcers retreat in defeat, but the aftermath leaves questions about repercussions, lingering threats, and how the community will respond to the exposure of their deceit. The driveway was quiet now. The impostors had vanished, slipping away like shadows exposed under harsh light, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their failed intimidation. My heart rate gradually slowed, but my mind remained alert. In my line of work, victory doesn't mean relaxation, it means constant awareness, anticipation of the next move, and understanding the full implications of what just transpired. I stepped into my home, closing the door behind me with a soft click that sounded like the final seal of control. Everything inside, my living room, my kitchen, even the mundane corners of my house, felt charged with a new significance. This was no longer just a home. It was a fortress, not because of walls or locks, but because the events of the day had demonstrated an undeniable truth. I was prepared, capable, and unshakable. The reality of the confrontation began to settle in. On one hand, it had been a psychological chess match, every movement calculated, every subtle shift leveraged to break the imposter's bluff. On the other hand, it had been a revelation of what happens when ordinary people overreach. The fake HOA enforcers had assumed authority could be manufactured, that intimidation alone could bend reality to their whims. But I had shown them the stark difference between illusion and reality. I reflected on every moment of the standoff. The initial approach, the bluffs, the subtle cues of fear I had observed, and the calculated steps I had taken to assert dominance. They all formed a narrative of precise control. I realized how easily people can be manipulated by appearances, how much weight perception carries, and how quickly the illusion of power can crumble when confronted with truth. Word of the incident would inevitably spread. Neighbors who had watched from behind blinds, who had heard snippets of commotion, would whisper, speculate, and analyze every detail. I knew this was unavoidable, and in some ways desirable. Let the HOA and the community know that overreach has consequences. Let them understand that intimidation has limits, and those limits are not for the faint of heart to test. I went outside, surveying my lawn, the driveway, the subtle angles that had made the standoff so navigable. Every step, every tactical decision, every controlled gesture had led to the outcome I wanted. The imposters had underestimated me, and in doing so, they had revealed the fragility of their constructed authority. My home was safe, and my reputation, at least within the subtle network of neighbors and community eyes, was reinforced as someone not to be trifled with. The adrenaline lingered, a faint hum beneath the surface, reminding me that while the confrontation was over, vigilance remained essential. I reflected on the imposters themselves, the fear, confusion, and helplessness I had observed. They had entered the driveway assuming control, only to discover they were outmatched at every level. The humiliation they would carry, the lessons they would learn about overconfidence and deception, were the echoes of victory I would carry silently in my mind. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had defended my home, upheld my personal boundaries, and demonstrated the difference between illusion and reality. But I also understood that power comes with responsibility. My training, my instincts, my ability to assess threats, all of these were tools, and tools must be wielded with care. I knew the HOA would regroup, their pride bruised, their bluff exposed. Some might seek revenge, some might attempt more subtle forms of harassment. But I was prepared. This incident was a lesson not just for them, but for anyone who might try to overstep their bounds. Boundaries are real, and so is accountability. As night fell, I walked through my home, checking doors, surveying windows, and mentally replaying every step of the day. Each detail reinforced the lesson: preparation, awareness, and composure are far more powerful than brute force or manufactured authority. The imposters had learned it the hard way. I had demonstrated it flawlessly. And in the quiet of my home, I allowed a final thought to settle: suburban life, with all its false authorities and petty rules, could be unpredictable, but no imposter, no bluff, and no intimidation could ever override the skill, experience, and resolve of someone trained to face true danger. I had turned fear into control, deception into revelation, and chaos into order, all without losing sight of who I was or what I stood for. The HOA might try again, the community might murmur, but one truth remained unshakable. I was Alex Mercer, a SWAT commander, a homeowner, and a force they would never underestimate again. And as I finally settled into the calm of the evening, the world outside my home had shifted, subtly but permanently, under the weight of reality I had imposed. Victory was mine, not through aggression, but through strategy, composure, and mastery of the moment. And in that victory, I found not just safety, but a profound reminder: true authority isn't claimed, it's earned, demonstrated, and undeniable. The fake HOA enforcers retreat, exposed and humiliated, while Alex secures his home and reasserts his authority. The story closes with a reflection on control, psychological dominance, and the lasting impact of standing firm against intimidation.